When we talk about horizontal transitions, we refer to the passage of students, skills, resources or lives across communities or territories or educational institutions, but without any change in level of education, otherwise it represents a vertical transition. And this concept implies a series of aspects and challenges, of course, including educational and curriculum continuity, or the equity in access to educational and community resources, or the collaboration between institutions. It's important to say, in my opinion, that you may deal with very different type of situations, because you may have an adult refugee who is coming from a country to another one because of political, economic issues, or you may have a student, in particular a student in a vulnerable situation, such as a disability, learning difficulties or psychological issues. And it's really important to focus on the specific situation in order to plan a personalized intervention.
Yes, and if you want to imagine a coordinate plane, we've got that image in our chapter, which is from our team colleague who can't be here today, Nariko Hashida. And so you have your vertical axis, which is the chronological things that happen to you in your life: birth, kindergarten, preschool, primary school, and so on and so forth. And on the horizontal axis, you have things that are happening on the same time plane. So like Francesca said, it could be, for example, switching schools within the same grade. It could be some kind of relocation. It could be that you're switching programs. So that's what we have been looking at in our discussions. And in order to do that, we would like to give you some kind of framework. So we've invited a guest, Petra, who will be telling us something about Schlossberg's theory.
So Schlossberg's transition theory can be really helpful in understanding not just what transitions are, but also what might help people cope really well or not so well, and how to support students as well. So whatever type of transition we're talking about, they tend to exist on a continuum. So they can be formal or informal. It could be leaving one school to move to another. It could be planned. It could be something that has been on the cards for 2 years and then it gradually happens. Or it could be completely unplanned. It could be someone having to flee a country to move to another. And some transitions are really easy. Some transitions are really, really difficult. So every transition is sort of on a continuum in all those respects. And the theory actually came from research that Schlossberg did when she interviewed people who had been made redundant. They were let go from a particular workplace. So these were adults who worked in a place for a long time. They were made unemployed sort of overnight, so a very unplanned sort of transition. And then she figured after a period of time, some coped really well, some managed this exceptionally well, and some really, really struggled. So she was interested to figure out what is it that makes some people cope so well and others not so well. And what she found was that you can sort of identify 4 different categories that are really important to look at. So she calls them the 4 S's. So you have situation, that's the environment that we're in, and that's related to the transition itself, I suppose, as well. What are you moving from? What are you moving into? But also the self. Who are we? What am I part of a minority group? Am I struggling in any other respects? What sort of psychological resources do I have? What are my outlook? What's my outlook, or what values do I have? And the third S is support. So that's relating to external resources, external from myself. So that would be things like support I get from my family, friends I have. If I have a really solid core group of friends if I move from one school to another. Even though you might be leaving those friends, you still have sort of a sense of support possibly from them. But if you've come from a situation where you might have been bullied in one school and having to move to a different school, well, that's already really shaky kind of grounds. And then the fourth S is strategies. So these are strategies in terms of how do we cope with maybe unplanned events in our life, because we all go through transitions. No one can go through life without transitioning from something at some point. But what are our strategies? When we find something stressful happening, do we cope by avoiding the situation, pretend it's not happening? If we have a stressful dentist appointment, do we just forget about it, not show up? Or do we talk about it with friends? Do we share our problems? So what sort of strategies do we have when something a bit stressful happens? So situation, self, support and strategies, they're the 4 S's. And when schools consider then, so as I said, the research behind the theory came from an adult setting, but we can draw on the learnings from that into various settings. And if we're looking at schools, for example, there are sort of, Schlossberg would argue that there are a number of things that we can do. So first of all, relationship building is really central and foundational to how we support someone. So if we're considering someone coming into a school where you work, regardless of that transition having been easy, difficult, or planned or unplanned, you will still need to do that relationship building. And then she would argue as well that it's important to assess those 4 S's. So we're looking at, well, what is this particular person? So everyone's different. What's this person's situation? What sort of, what are their psychological resources? And these things, when I'm saying assessing, that's through conversations, through dialogue, and really getting to know the person. And also looking at what type of supports do they have? Do they have a very supportive family that are, really keen for them to thrive in this new school, or is there neglect going on at home? And also assess what strategies they tend to use. So again, might be exploring things from their background. Even things like asking, when you moved from kindergarten to primary school, how did that feel for you? Or if they're a bit older, maybe it's when they moved from even things like going from summer holidays back into school at the start of the new year. So exploring strategies used in the past to see how might that support them going forward. And then once you've assessed that and you have a really good idea of who it is you're dealing with, to look at setting goals. So you're also setting goals in terms of the situation. What's the ideal situation that we want? What are the sort of goals in terms of your psychological resources? How can you support yourself? What are the supports that we think should be in place? And the strategies then. What are positive and constructive strategies to use? So it's relationship building, assessment of the 4 S's, goal setting in terms of those 4 S's, and then to implement that. So that's kind of quite a organised structure, and the 4 S's is useful because it kind of prompts us to think about, it's not just about the support they have, it's also about the values they have. So we really have to build that relationship and the strategies that they've used in the past. And we can all be stuck in ways of doing things, but even to learn about what are other strategies. If it doesn't usually work that well, what could we do differently? Or do you know someone who seems to find it easy to transition between one thing and another? And what can we learn from them? So it's quite a nice structured way for schools to work with students that transition horizontally from possibly another school or another country, another type of schooling. So whatever that transition is, these 4 S's kind of provides a structure that's quite universal for whatever type of transition.
We try to, because horizontal transitions can be all kinds of things. They can be voluntary, they could be involuntary. So we were trying to come up with key aspects that are generalized so that you would be able to take them home with you. You would be able to apply them to different situations so that they can be useful. So we've tried to narrow it down to 4 key aspects which we think are important in horizontal transitions generally. So Francesca will now start presenting to you our first key aspect.
Yes, our first keyword is collaboration. Because we have talked about a lot about this term, collaboration. What is collaboration? Who are involved in our collaboration? So I will give you an example, just to talk about the actors of this process. 3 years ago, I worked with a young boy, and he had severe behavioral difficulty and totally lack of control of his own emotions. And you know, in Italy, scholastics here starts in September. So from September to December, he hired 4 teachers. And the new special teacher, she has known me yet. And one day she called me because they were desperate. So I went to the school and I met this young boy. He was 8 at that time. And he was as tall as me. Well, it's not so complicated, but you know, anyway. And, you know, I had a very funny moment with him at school, very creative moment with him, with all with his classmates. And in order to, you know, build a first relationship between he and me and to get trust each other. And then I met, of course, the parents and the neuropsychiatrists and the psychologists who have been working with him. And the first step was to identify the most important need of the child and of his parent. And in Italy, we have this official document, which is I'm going to translate literally. It's the Educational Community Plan. It's a document in which you can find all the actors involved in an educational project, in an educational process. Okay, so that's what we did. We identified, together with the parents, the neuropsychiatrists, the psychologists, all the teachers of the classroom, not just the special teacher, but all of them. We identified the stakeholders that can help us. So at the end, this young boy attended for 3 to 4 hours a day lessons in the mainstream school together with his classmates. And then we organized the public transport responsible to take him from school and bring him to a medical and educational center where he had his therapies and educational activities together with other children and other educators. And then some days of the week, the public transport was responsible to take him back to school in order to attend the other activities or back home. And for me, this is a perfect example of a collaboration, because if for example, if I need to identify the actors of this example, I can say there was the child at first and his family, and they was at the center of this process. And then we have the school, so all of the teachers. We have the medical center, we have the educational centers, we have the political institutions, because they organize the public transport service. And for 3 years, we were in this process together with a common purpose, the well-being of the child, the well-being of the family. The purpose was to build a support system for the child and for the family. So for me, this is an example of collaboration.
Yeah. And I can add to that. In Germany, Germany is reputed to be extremely bureaucratical. And I would agree that it is. I have yet to find a country that has more paperwork than Germany. Maybe it exists, but I don't know. And in Germany, we have the same kinds of procedures. And it's a lot more paperwork, I think, than in other places. And usually you don't get to meet the people behind the paper. So there is very little actual meeting, having conference, having discussions, but there is much more paper forms going backwards and forwards, which is a problem very often for transparency. And it's also a problem because it doesn't really take into the consideration the child and the family. It's more talking about them than it is talking with them. And I remember that especially our school was very reputed to have an extremely bad relationship, especially with Child Protective Services, which wasn't an issue to our school specifically, but the region in northern Germany where I come from, the institutions, from my perception, wouldn't work well together. And so there were many documents that you had to file if you wanted cases to be worked on. And you would very often not get an answer, or people would flat out refuse to talk to you because they didn't want the institutions to collaborate. They would say, this is school, this is Child Protective Services, this is medical facilities, and they are not allowed to collaborate for legal reasons, or they are not supposed to collaborate, or things like that. And I used to get very, very frustrated with that because school is part of all of these aspects of a child's life, especially when you're planning transition. And very often schools are the first actors who get to the child and who then have to plan the next steps. Mm-hmm. So in the district that I work in, we have extremely high crime and poverty rates. So we have a lot of dramatical family situations that require us, for example, to relocate a child. So the procedure in that case would be that you alert Child Protective Services, you would inform them of what is happening in the child's family unit, and they would then decide what will happen to the child. But usually, up until that point, that's where the communication stopped. So I would give them the information and I would get nothing back. The child would get no response, and we were just sitting there waiting, wondering what Child Protective Services were doing, whether we would be getting a response or not. And the response could also be that somebody from CPS would come into your classroom and just collect a child out of your classroom with no notification beforehand, which I believe is extremely traumatizing to the child and everybody present. So I used to have a very big problem with that until one day we wanted to take a young girl into custody because there was a very dramatic situation in her home, and it was clear she would not be able to go home. So first of all, I sat down with the girl and I explained to her what the situation is and how the procedure worked so that she would understand exactly in detail what are the next steps. Transparency, really important. So she had her bag packed. We were sitting in my office and I was explaining to her, we are going to call Child Protective Services. Someone is going to pick up the phone. This is what we're going to say. And we had the hope, because we had planned this transition before, me and the girl, that she would be able to go to a woman who was prepared to foster her, who was an ex-colleague of mine, a very nice lady who knew the girl, who had a small house and a small family, and she had said that she would be willing to take her in. So in my eyes, it was the best thing that you could have made out of a drastic situation. But Child Protective Services doesn't work that way in Germany. So you need to call the hotline, basically. You don't know who's going to pick up the phone. And it is very likely that they're going to say, that's a lovely idea. That's not how it works in Germany. We are going to take her to one of the holding facilities. And I had explained this to the girl because I think it's very important to prepare them for the scenarios that could be happening so that she can brace herself. And luckily enough, a gentleman who I hadn't met before picked up the phone, and I was explaining the situation to him, and the girl was looking at me. And I said, right, I've got this girl here sitting in my office. This is the situation at home. So I've taken her into custody, and we have a very good idea of where she could stay. And I thought his answer was going to be, yeah, well, it's your idea. You get to keep that. And then he said, no, let's hear the idea. And I told him about it, and told him that I would like to take him to this lady who was willing to take her in. And he agreed. And he was very laid back about it. And he said, right, well, you can take her there. I will come this afternoon and visit this family and check up whether everything's okay. And he did that, and he was very nice about it. We sat outside in the family's garden and had coffee together and cake. And the girl got to explain her situation. He got to know everybody. So it was the smoothest transition and the most ideal situation and outcome of a very dramatic situation for her. And the good thing is, out of that came a lot more collaboration, because then I got to talking with this gentleman and explained the trouble that we'd been having with Childhood Protective Services. And we, from that, struck up a kind of friendship. So we started meeting quite regularly, because I said, I think we need to meet on a regular basis and discuss what we're doing, not just discuss specific children, but discuss how has my week been, how has your week been, what cases are you working on, what have problems been, and we should include more people in this discussion. Because for one thing, it gives me insight, so I get less frustrated when I don't get answers from CPS, for example, because I understand they're not sitting in their office looking at the wall, they are doing the following things. There is actually human beings behind that paperwork. And the same goes for all the other institutions that are included. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I don't know whether it would be like that in other countries, but the first reaction people had when I invited them literally to coffee was, like, what do they want now? And it's another appointment, and I don't have time. People in social areas who work in social areas are always overworked, and they never have time, and they're always afraid of new responsibilities coming their way. And so it took us some time to actually establish a little group of people from various institutions who would meet. And we still have these meetings to this day very regularly. And I put a lot of effort into it being welcoming. So I will put a plant on the table. I will get some cake. I will make some coffee. And we don't have to discuss work, but we can discuss work. And now it's like a group of friends or colleagues getting together and just sort of swapping information, speaking about our problems, venting. And everybody likes these meetings now. And so these barriers have been reduced. People go out feeling empowered. They go out feeling maybe relaxed because they got to vent. They go out having shared new information. And that's something that has now over the years grown to be a very, very regular thing. I remember in the beginning, I had to beg people to please, we just want to have coffee. I promise it's not going to be a big issue. And they were very apprehensive. And now they literally call me and say, when's the next meeting? I have to talk. I have things that I need to discuss.
Well, but the sad thing is that it seems to be that you had luck, because that man answered to your call.
Yes.
So, it could be easier if it becomes a system.
Yes, for one thing a system, but for another, I think we're always talking about relationship building with students, with families. I think we need to make that bigger. Mm-hmm. We need to build relationships with institution, with administration. They're not just a function, they're not just a piece of paper, there's human beings sitting behind it. And it's always, I get criticized for it sometimes because people tend to think it's unprofessional. That's not what I'm trying to do. But if we establish a relationship, we can support each other, we can feel safe, we can feel trusted, and we can help each other out. So I think this relationship thing, it should go through the entire social sector. So yes, I do need to have a relationship with my administration. I do need to have a relationship with the Childhood Protective Service worker. So yeah, that's important.
I think this leads us to our second keyword, because we have chosen communication. All of the relationships are made by communication. And we thought it's a really big word, talking about horizontal transition, because you need an honest dialogue between professionals, competences, resources. And in order to do this, in order to have this communication, you need to speak the same language. Because I could be a teacher and you could be a neuropsychiatrist, but we are working together. We are walking through the same direction, which is, of course, again, the well-being of the person, whoever he is. And so we need to speak the same language. For example, what I said before, the story about the young boy I worked with. At the beginning of this process, we arranged a lots of meetings between, in the first phase, between me, the psychologist, the neuropsychiatrist, and the young boy, because we truly wanted to listen about his interests, his passions, his needs, what he wanted to do, how he used to feel inside of him. And then we had lots of meetings with the parents and the other actors. And it was a key aspect to find each other sitting at the same table, talking about the same things and speaking the same language, in order to go through our purposes.
Yep. Yes, I agree. I think for me, the whole transition aspect is in two parts of my job. One part is, of course, the transitioning of the students from regular school who join my project, which has the focus on social emotional disabilities, and the other is refugee work. And of course, language and communication and refugee work is a very big key aspect in a very literal sense. So for me, for example, apart from understanding their situation, and you can do that by just letting people talk. I just recently read again, you should talk 20% yourself and 80% you should let the other person talk and try to find out everything about them. But also for me, that would mean I learn Arabic when I speak to Arabic refugees, which is not about me actually learning Arabic fluently so that I could have this conversation in Arabic. It's a gesture. It's an olive branch, if you will. And it's always a good door opener because then we get to laugh about my ridiculous pronunciation in Arabic. And they feel less self-conscious about saying things in German. And that's always a fantastic door opener to sort of get people together and get them talking. And yet, still there are aspects that I, even with communication there, cannot solve. So especially when I speak to Arabic mothers who have fled from countries and from war zones, they have experienced things I will never be able to fathom. So I am happy to speak with them. I'm happy to listen to them. And I think that's what it should be about. Try to understand it and try to communicate it to other people if she can't do that. But I also try to include the community in that. It's very often a team effort. So I might ask other Arabic mothers to join me in these conversations. We had an Arabic mother recently who's just come to Germany 2 years ago. And she was struggling in many, many aspects of her life, also psychologically. And she spoke no German at all. And we managed to navigate the Arabic language, but I started realizing she had a lot of support systems for her and her children. She had social workers, she had child protective services, she had me, and she had many others. But in that, I sat there and I was looking at her and I thought, this woman needs other Arabic mothers who have been in her situation, who know the culture, who know what it's like to flee from a country and from a war zone. And that is something none of us in this support system can ever be. So that's the kind of support we need to get in, which is a lovely thing to see happen because it actually works. There are some Arabic mums that I've known since they came over to Germany in 2015. And I explained the case to them, and the mother had agreed that I explained the case to them. And I hadn't even finished telling the story. And they immediately started getting up, putting their coats on and saying, where does this woman live? We need to go and see her. We need to go and speak to her immediately. And I thought it's wonderful. And it's wonderful because you have this synergy. It was these Arabic mothers from 2015 who needed the support then, and now they get to be in the situation to support other mums.
Again, the community.
Yes, it's so
The
nice.
importance of the community. Yes, of course.
Okay, and we have the next key aspect, which I think matches quite well, which is social and emotional support. So we were talking about social emotional support, and again, that is a vast field. And since every horizontal transition is different, every person is different, the context changes, the settings change, there's not one thing that you can advise people to do.
Petra said that too.
Yes.
The easy or
It is
easy
so
transition.
individual. It is so individual, and it also depends on, was that transition your choice or was it not? Was it forced upon you? So it depends very much on what exactly your needs are in that moment. And I think it's very important to discuss that with the person in question, which for me, very first and foremost, is the young learner. Then secondly, the family, and then I will speak to all the other people and we will try to find out what they need. And for us, it was very important that some of the needs that children have in these transitions is they have the feeling often of losing themselves. Like you come to a different country and you are supposed to become a different person. You have to adapt to that country. You have to adapt to that culture. If, for example, it is a geographic horizontal transition. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about things like marginalization, about your own identity, how you feel about that. And for me, something that came to mind when we were talking about identity was, again, language in a sense and culture in a sense, because there is a big discussion in Germany about integration. Mm-hmm. And I think integration is a very big word. And personally, I believe that a lot of what German government calls integration, in my eyes, is assimilation. Because we have really no clear definition. Yeah. Like when are you integrated properly? When is your transition finished and you are now officially integrated and have fully transitioned into what?
What?
Exactly. And in this process, I find it ridiculous. I was telling Francesca that it's different for young children and for children and adults. And the first and foremost thing, of course, is language. So children in school, they get put into language courses and they have exactly 1 year to learn the German language. And then for legal reasons and political reasons, they get transferred into a regular class. It doesn't matter whether they speak German or not. We have cases of children who don't speak any German at all after 1 year, for reasons. There are reasons that a child maybe can't learn when it's had to flee a country. But I think it would be taking it too far to go into that. But it doesn't take the child and its needs into consideration. And then another thing that will often happen in German schools, but I do find that people are starting to question that, is telling the children that they have to change their culture. They are not allowed to speak their mother tongue. So they will hear very often in school, speak German. We're in Germany, you have to speak German. You have to speak German in the class, outside of the class, and, which I find is completely unrealistic, at home as well. And I don't agree with any of that because I cannot compare myself to a refugee, but I have a dual nationality. So I grew up with 2 passports, 2 languages, and 2 cultures. And I remember, for me, it was extremely unsettling, especially as a teenager, because I kept asking myself the question, where do I belong? Now I'm 40 and this has gone away, but I remember very, very clearly wanting to have some kind of group of people who I belong to. And when I was in Germany, I was the English girl. And when I was in England, I was the German girl. And it sounds very insignificant, and in comparison to others it is. But still, it was an aspect that really had me thinking, because I had the feeling I don't belong to any group. I'm nowhere, I'm sort of part of this group. And if you multiply that, you can apply that to the situation of them as well, especially seeing that their language is almost forbidden completely. And I think language and your nationality is a part of who you are. It's a part of your identity. And by me telling you, Francesca, you're not allowed to speak your mother tongue, I'm saying that a part of you isn't welcome here. A part of you is not okay. a part of your culture is not okay. We can't have that.
So I need to delete my
Yes.
half part of life.
And also, what happens, because children are young and impressionable, they will start forgetting. And I think that is such a shame, especially since we seem to have this prioritization of languages, and Arabic is not a very prestigious language to be able to speak. So it would be more prestigious if you could speak French or Latin, but Arabic is worth less. So that's sort of an example that I would have, where I think young learners need support and they need understanding. They need somebody to be willing to hear their side of the story, to get to know their culture, to maybe learn their language for a couple of words, which again is an olive branch. And it makes transitions easier because it makes you feel welcome in a sense. Because that is something that in many transitions, especially if they're not voluntary, will not happen.
I would like to say something just about my job, because in my experience with children with disabilities, I always think it could be really hard to have a son or a daughter with a disability, because it's a kind of situation that takes your life as a parent and it puts it up down, like in a second. Yeah. And I think it may be really, really frustrated, even because when I talk with parents, they always say that it's like they need to trust. For example, if we have a student with disability who is moving from a school to another, okay, it's like a beginning, a new beginning. You need to start again, okay? And what parents used to say to me, it's like you must trust the teachers from the new school because you have no other choices. So you literally give your son or your daughter's life in their hands. And they say, okay, please help him or help her. But, they, unfortunately, they often get into prejudices or the idea that because my son or my daughter has some kind of disability, she or he is not capable of. So you need to prove that this child can do something. You need to go there and say, look, in the previous school, my son, my daughter was doing this. He can. You need to believe that, And the sad thing, this is the part of my job that I hate the most, is to realize that and see with my eyes the behavior of the teacher when they see a new student with disability, and sometimes they are like, okay, maybe we can try, maybe something easy. No, for example, in Italy, speaking of linking to collaboration and communication, in Italy we have another formal document, which is we call it PEI. It's the Individualized Educational Plan, and it's a document in which you can, where you can read the educational history of the child. So, why we use this document? Because it's a way to facilitate the new context. I'm giving you this child, I'm giving you his life, but I'm also giving you an instrument you can use to help you. So in this document, you will find the actors that were involved in his or her life, the biography, the capabilities, the peculiarities, the interests. You have everything. Of course, life is not a static thing. You know, life changes, and this is the most amazing thing of our life. And so you need to make some adjustment during, you know, your direction, and this is fine. But it represents just like a first step that we can make together to help my son or my daughter, you know, but believing in his capabilities or in their capabilities, believing that he or she is a person. And in my job, I truly put the school at the center of this big process, because our students spend most of their time at school. So I truly put the school at the center. And I really believe that teachers can do a lot if they only trust in, you know, capabilities, or in the sense of community, of, you know, working together to help each other. You know.
Yes.
Don't cry.
You're absolutely right. I'm very touched.
So, sorry for the passion, but that's
very
what, because we are talking about, you know, the emotional side of the story. So I think it's important to underline even this, you know, with some tears, but to underline this aspect. And we are going to close this session with
learner-centered approach and participation. What I will say, especially about being learner-centered and participation, is that what I think happens very often, and I include myself there, is we have this moral superiority that we believe we know what is best for the young learners. Because that's our job. It's our job to assess them. It is our job to think about what exactly would be best for them. And of course, many of us have been doing that job for a while. Mm-hmm. So especially those people who have been doing it for a couple of years will tend to assess students and think that we know the answers. We know what they are capable of doing. We know what's best for them.
Without asking.
Yes, very often in the process of that, we'll forget to ask. And I think so many children have surprised me in things, because I had assumptions about what they could do, what they would like, what they wouldn't like. And I was surprised every single time, as long as I would ask them and as long as I would give them some liberties and some freedom to actually show me these qualities, these abilities, and these wishes and dreams that they had. Like the example I was telling a couple of people about of a young girl who is in my group for social and emotional difficulties, and who was assessed in every way, shape, and form by doctors, by teachers, by psychologists. And all of these assessments and tests went incredibly badly by the standards that there are. So especially the IQ testing went very badly. And so, of course, when this girl transitioned into my group, I had certain assumptions in the beginning of what she would be capable of doing and not doing. But she proved us all wrong in a very different and unexpected way, because I learned how to knit. And and I had actually planned to learn how to knit myself to help me relax. And I brought my knitting to school, and then it somehow evolved into something else, which was the children knitting. And it started with this, at the time, 12-year-old girl. And since I hadn't planned to do it with the children, I was doing it during break, it ended up with her just taking some of the knitting needles and the wool and teaching herself how to knit. Now, since I have just recently learned knitting as well, I found it quite complicated. And this young girl was able to do it all by herself. Not only was she able to do it by herself, she came up to me 2 days later and informed me that we needed black and brown wool because she needed to knit a dog. because I bring my dog to school and she really likes the dog. So of course now she was required to knit it. And of course I supplied her with the wool and she managed to knit a dog, a child that according to some tests was not very intelligent, and a child who had severe needs was able to concentrate for hours on this task and teach it to herself. A task that I wasn't able to do. And if she hadn't had the liberty or I hadn't spoken to her about what she wanted to do, I would never have known that. I would have gone through life without the information that she can do that. And the good thing is, once you pick up on one of those details, you start looking for more. I'm sure that this girl has so many talents and qualities, and she is an amazing human being, but you need to sometimes sort of take all the assessing that you have to do in school and all the documentation, throw it out of the window, and maybe not literally throw it out of the window, but, you know, and actually take some time to sit with a person and to get to know them.
About participation, I really want to say just the last thing, because it came to my mind really often, identity word. Because, you know, you said this before, during this horizontal transition, I think that the most dangerous risk is to lose your identity. Why that? I can give 2 examples. Let's think about the adult refugee. Okay, he used to live in a country, maybe had a family, a job, just a life, and for some reason he has to move. Okay, and most of the time, if we think about immigration, they need to move alone, looking for another job, looking for, you know, a more safe space. Is that right? Mm-hmm. More safe space or safer? Safer space. So looking for a safer space or a safer context. And, you know, the risk is that this adult refugee will be in another country losing pieces of himself, because he will have to adapt his entire life to a new context, to a new language, to a new culture, to a new way of communicate, okay? So if we don't build this support system, the risk is this, that he could lose his identity. Or the second example is, let's think about a child with a disability and a child who is growing up, who is experiencing the world, who is building his or her own identity. And if this child needs, for some reason, again, to move, for example, from a school to another, or from school to a medical center, to a hospital, to an association, something like this, for this child, the risk is to, you know, to interrupt his or her development, which is a delicate phase of the life of a child who is building his or her own identity. And so, in my opinion, this is one of the biggest risks. And for example, in Italy, we have another official document. We have a lot of official documents about disabilities. And the translation is Life Project. And it's a document that follows the entire life of a person. You know, like the lifelong learning vision. you know. So if you have a child with a disability or you know, in a vulnerable situation of any kind, you can have this document always and again made by the parents, the social assistant, the schools and medical centers and whoever. And it represents like the, you know, the continuity of the educational project of that life. You know, it's like we are here and we will work together in your, you know, in your life. And I think it's one of the most functional and helpful instrument we have in Italy.